Hello and welcome to Lecture 7, the last lecture in this series at Phil 10, Critical Thinking here at Penn State Berks. This lecture is Principles of Interpretation and Argument Assessment. There's going to be a little bit more slides in this one than the previous one simply because I want to be more systematic in how I should walk you through the argument. So it's not that it's necessarily more comprehensive and harder to absorb. I just think it's going to be clearer if I can lay it out step by step. So we're going to talk about this idea of interpretation and enthymemes. If you found that many of the examples that were used in the text or in this course seem to be simple and therefore obvious as applications for whatever it was that we were talking about at the time, and then you're thinking to yourself, but in the real world that's not exactly how arguments are laid out, today is going to be the day when we affirm that belief and then show you how you work what we've already learned as an application to those texts and arguments in the real world. Because oftentimes the difficulty is simply just trying to determine what exactly is being said. And the reason is because the order of the conclusions and the premises are not quite in the same logical sequence that we've had experienced as far as the syllogism is. So they're randomly placed. And also there can be arguments embedded within the arguments, and that takes a little time to ferret out. Not everything is explicit. Sometimes propositions are left implied. Oftentimes they're left out entirely if they are thought to be obvious. So if somebody were to give you two premises and never follow up, and you would then say, oh, so what you mean is this, they're going to say, well, yeah, what else can you possibly assume from what I just said? So if they think it's obvious, they'll leave it out. And the same thing with conclusions, just like propositions that are used in the premises. Oftentimes they'll leave that out and they expect you to supply it. Perhaps it's assumed, perhaps they're trying to divert you from some other known truth. Various reasons there could be. So these enthymemes are the description of any time we have an argument where either the conclusion or some of the premises, at least one of these, is not explicitly stated. It could be for various reasons. Now, we already know that the average person's idea of an argument is more of a quarrel, right? So we've now learned what an argument is and how one works through it in syllogistic fashion. So a person could be leaving out things simply because they believe that the premises that they've given are stronger than they actually are. So if somebody were to just try to say this to you, now it's not proper argument, but if they were to say this to you, people have to stop having children. The world is overcrowded. First off, this idea of world overcrowded may be questioned in the sense of exactly what is the capacity in the world, for humans. When would we be overcrowded? When do we stop? If we all just stop having children, of course that's going to reduce the population. Or should we be aiming at zero population growth? So they may not think that anything else is needed. And this is typically a bias that we would accept with those that we share the particular concern for. So anytime when you're speaking and it doesn't really sound convincing, but the person across from you is nodding their heads, well, they're already accepting whatever it is that we're giving them. So the strength of it isn't really the strength of the argument, isn't necessarily the question. But oftentimes people are deceptive and they simply don't want their argument to be critically examined. So if somebody were to simply say the world is overcrowded because people keep having children, maybe within that, this idea of civilization will not survive in an overcrowded world. It's not really spoken, right? But nonetheless, it appears there. And then they want you to assume that civilization will not survive if people keep having children. So the whole idea there is that civilization will not survive, was just, something that was implied, and that people have to stop having children, the world is overcrowded. I mean, that was their intention to tell you civilization will not survive. And then the full idea of the implication of the premise or the conclusion, civilization will not survive if people keep having children. Now, they may not feel that their initial argument was strong enough, so they're going to leave that part out, and hopefully that you'll share a bias with them or simply not, critically examine their argument, and then from there, perhaps they would at least feel that they've won. So again, if we think that our premises are stronger than they actually are, it's because of some confirmation bias we have with the conclusion we're trying to make. If we don't want our particular premises, or perhaps even a conclusion we're left out, to be part of an argument that's going to be overly critically examined, it could be simply because we want to have this rhetorical force of the overall point which we're making. Now, what's important is that I've been trying to make the idea known throughout this course is that we're not concerned with winning an argument. What would that be, right? We want to work out the argument and arrive at truth. So the only way to win, and it's not a good term to use, would be to arrive at truth, not simply to have the other person cower or agree with you, perhaps in your mistaken strength of the argument, or that you're just using some rhetorical device to get them to bow down to your level of outrage, any of those things. Now, we always want to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's often called the principle of charity, too. So this is a principle of valuing the argument, but putting it into its strongest form. So the steelman argument. In other words, we want to interpret it within the context of whatever they're presenting. That's just being a nice person. And if we're going to help them work through the argument and reconstruct it, we want to make sure we're reconstructing it in a way that's compatible with the original context. Now, that means for the sake of truth, which is our goal, not simply to win, we're going to really try to avoid trivial matters. In other words, let's not ourselves bring up frivolous points, nor let's not focus on other people's frivolous points. Let's not object to that. If it's, and when you often hear yourself say, well, I just meant that as an aside. It's not really part of what I'm trying to say. They're almost trying to guide you, or we would be trying to guide others to say, that's just trivial. In other words, in these particular arguments, if somebody were to say people have to stop having children, the world is overcrowded, there's no reason for us to go in and talk about should governments have the power to do this, who would enforce this. It's a side, maybe an interesting point, but not in this particular argument. And also nitpicking. Let's not focus on the ambiguous terms in the proposition. In other words, civilization, we kind of know within the context of what they mean, like the fact that we live in community. We don't have to say, well, what do you mean by civilized? Because there are plenty of cultures that aren't civilized, like, say, the proper, public behaviors that we might learn. You can think of like English, monarchy and such. That would just be nitpicking. And also, we don't want to have some sort of point that's disproportionately strong for what we're trying to say. In other words, if you were trying to make the argument that people have to stop having children when the world is overcrowded, there's no sense at this point trying to come up with how much food is out there and how much calories do people actually need to survive. And if we all have this many, calories available to us, which is less than the people that is necessary for them to live in society, then therefore there's going to be an issue with your argument. It's getting a little bit disproportionately strong. You don't need to add that at this point. And also, there's going to be some weaknesses that are just obvious. It could be because we misspoke, or it could just simply because we have not formed it right. In other words, it is true that it's going to be very difficult to determine exactly what overcrowded means. But this, again, is not the point where we break that down. It's perfectly fine to talk about it and another aspect of the argument. But remember, this is the argument that they're trying to make. Just that people have to stop having children because the world is overcrowded. So we're trying to determine whether or not that itself is valid and sound. And then disproving. In other words, just because they have given you a weak argument and you've disproven their weak argument doesn't mean that their conclusion is false, right? In other words, you can say to them, well, the way you've worded it, nobody would survive if we, as a society, if we didn't keep having children. Okay, now, the idea here would be that that does refute that particular way that the argument was presented, but it doesn't mean that their conclusion that overpopulation is a concern is false itself. So we have to be very careful that simply because we disprove a weak argument doesn't mean that there isn't a stronger argument to really make their point. Now, our concern here is that if we do these trivial matters, nitpicking and assumptions, they're really methods of diversion and, quite frankly, uncharitable. And if we simply just try to exploit and disprove these weaker things, then really we're just setting up a straw man fallacy. So we're trying to work through all of that so we can get, again, help them work out the argument for the sole purpose to arrive at truth. Now, in reconstructing the argument, there's particular guidelines that we should at least keep in mind. In other words, we would be doing what we're calling a close reading, and we're going to try to make some very secure logical judgments, and our endeavor is simply to strengthen what it is that they're saying. It should be obvious that the fact that you are engaging with somebody in an argument does not mean that you are agreeing with them, or that you're condoning the way that they particularly might be thinking through the idea. And if you do at least see within the argument that their content, the way that it's been laid out, is valid, that doesn't mean then that you would agree with their conclusion. And the fact that you say, well, it's a valid argument is not proof that you are in agreement with them. In the end, we're going to refute or accept. So if their argument form and logically is sound, is valid, and the premises are true, and therefore a sound premises, well, let me put it this way, true premises put together in a logically valid way, the conclusion must logically be accepted as true. So if it changes our mind, then let it change our mind, and we'll accept it. If not, then let's go after it and refute it. But again, our goal isn't to win the argument, our goal is to get to the truth. Now, the way that you would do this, there's a few different techniques, is that you can add a premise to attempt to make the argument valid. So here's an original. People have to stop having children. The world is overcrowded. So this really diagram is just, P therefore Q. Now, if we were to try to convert this into a modus tollens, we could say the world will not be overcrowded if people stop having children. So people will not stop having children, therefore the world will be overcrowded. So it's that if P then Q, well, it's not Q, therefore it's not P. If P then Q, Q is false, so then P2 is false. Now if we were to diagram this, we would have our, the Q, right, the people will not stop having children, and the A is what we have put in there, and that's supposed to give us the conclusion that the world will not be overcrowded. All right, so we could try to add this premise, and that was, the A there, in order for us to help make their argument at least put into a valid form. Because remember, just because they gave a really terrible argument, it's not an argument, it could be that we still are concerned with the conclusion, because we know how, overpopulation impacts various things from the environment and then in turn to the human person themselves. So nonetheless, the people will not stop having children would be that one that we are adding in there in an attempt to make their argument form valid. Another way to offer a guideline of interpretation is to state the missing premises clearly and simply determine the truth value. In other words, again with the original, people have to stop having children, the world is overcrowded. A less clear inserted premise might be, having less children will not leave a world overcrowded, but people keep having children, and you're leaving something out there. Like, hear this in a more fluid way. Having less children will not leave a world overcrowded, but people keep having children. Now, if somebody were just to say that to you, you probably would start asking questions, because at this juncture, you're asking yourself, what exactly is the truth value that I'm supposed to be evaluating here, right? If somebody just said, look, having less children is not going to leave a world overcrowded, but people keep having children. You're going to start thinking that you're answering a really convoluted multiple choice question on an exam, and that you're asking yourself, what exactly is this individual trying to say? So try to state, if you're going to restate the premises, do so clearly. And then use only minimum information to provide the argument so that it winds up in a valid form. Again, if people have to stop having children and the world is overcrowded, we could say, well, if people who can have children choose not to have children, the world will not be overcrowded. The world is overcrowded because people who can have children choose to have children. Now, when we say who can have children, those are the ones that are choosing not to have children? Wasn't that just a tautology? Aren't people who have children the ones who can't have children? I mean, isn't one necessary for the other? Yes. So the minute we say people who are choosing not to have children, we're already, assuming within there that it's those people who can't have children. So there's no reason for us to add more information. It's just going to make the whole argument sound a little more complicated. I mean, again, here's an application of a tautology that perhaps will help. All right, now what I did here is I pulled a paragraph off of a technology news article off of BBC, and we're going to walk through it. So it's good to do close readings. In other words, to really start an in-depth analysis of what exactly was being read. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to look for the indicators. Now, we've done this in the past, right? We've circled these. So anything that would give us a hint as to what is a premise or a conclusion. And then we're going to bracket out the sentences, and then we're going to number those. Now, we can break up, Sorites, or we can break up sentences in order for it to make more sense, like it's more fluid in how exactly we would read it out loud if we were to put it into a different form. But we don't want to break up conditionals, the if-then, or the disjunctives, the either-ors. And now we've sort of circled our indicator words. Now let's locate those premises, the conclusions and such. And then we're also going to keep in the back of our mind, are these premises dependent on each other to reach the conclusion, or are they independent of each other to reach the conclusion? And then we're also going to determine any missing premises, those enthymemes. And along with that, we're going to remove any unnecessary material. Now, this all seems like, well, how am I supposed to keep all this in my head when I'm reading something? When I'm done with this lecture, I think you're going to accept my conclusion. I'm going to go out on a limb on that one. And I think you're going to say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So remember, what logic and critical thinking does is it introduces the individual to the means to qualify why it is they think so. In other words, better than saying that doesn't make sense, here's why, you're going to actually be able to analyze it and say it doesn't make sense and here is why, and then point out A, B, and C, that type of thing. So a lot of this almost happens like, second nature and intuitively. It's a difference, not much different, I should say, that when we were younger and we had to learn grammar and we had to learn, how propositions work and adverbs and adjectives, and it seemed like a lot of little rules to put together. But over time, just in the use, we become very accustomed to it, and it makes sense to us. The same thing here. You're going to look at a particular text, you're going to try to say, what are the premises, the conclusion, and I'm going to know those by the indicator words. And I'm going to look at the various sentences that I have, make sure I number them. Are these dependent, independent clauses and such? And then I'm going to look for any missing premises and get rid of the material that we don't need. So what we're really doing here is we're trying to extract the argument from whatever text it is that we are presented with. So this is a text that I took, just one paragraph, from an article that said, why don't Facebook and Apple like each other? So what I'm going to do first off here is I'm just going to look for indicator words. Now I'm not going to bring up each and every one of these builds individually. And I may not have them all. Let me say up front that I'm not going to try to be exhaustive here because it would be simply too much to do on the slide. And also, these are different interpretations, or people can have different interpretations on how this would play out. As a matter of fact, I'm sure if I came back and revisited this particular text in a couple years from now without any of the information I have here, it could be that I do so in a slightly different fashion. I'd like to think that I get to the same conclusion and judgment in the end, but nonetheless. Now, we don't see like a lot of the normal indicators here. We don't see any like, so, therefore, hence. But I can almost hear when somebody says that's why, or that's where, or which comes, that they're trying to get to something, right? And when they say this is from that, you can almost hear the if-then type thing. Now, the semicolons and the dashes and such, oftentimes people use those just as grammatical moves to get to a particular conclusion or to say, here's why I've come to that. Nonetheless, this is just in a real cursory fashion the indicator words that I've come up with. Now with brackets, again, without being exhaustive, I tried to put brackets around at least what I thought were the more important sentences. All right. And then I went and I numbered them. Once I bracket them, just, 1 through, in this particular instance, 1 through 10. Now, what I'm going to do now is take this paragraph. Oh, and you could see I crossed out what I simply thought was not something that was pertinent to our argument. The fact that they led in with, this interesting but non-relevant fact that Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Boeing and Airbus, whatever, all have one thing for common: competition for the same business. That has nothing to do principally with the argument that they're making, at least in my view. And also, towards the end there, you see last year, according to the New York Times, Apple even cut off Facebook's developer tools. The last chapter in the feud for last week has made Revelations even worse. Not part of this argument, all right? So I just crossed those off. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take just the text that I did not cross off with the indicators the indicators circled, brackets there in numbers, and I'm just going to push that onto the next screen so we can analyze it a little bit better. But what we're going to do here this time is we're going to look for the conclusions and the premises, and then we're going to look for any of the missing premises, the enthymemes. And remember, we're trying to extract the argument. So this is just the exact capture from the previous slide. And all I'm going to do here now is I'm going to lay out the conclusion and the premises. Now you notice I didn't put in all of the premises. If I left the bracket there, I'm going to assume that those are one of the premises. The C's are the conclusion, at least what I think would be pertinent for the conclusions here. And the E is going to be things that I believe we have to add in there in order to make this a more fluid argument. So let's start to do that. We're going to lay out the argument. I'm going to say if Facebook's revenue is from advertising, then it is not from devices. All right, so you can see that I took the first premise there, Facebook's revenue is from advertising, and then the next one I kind of added it to make the whole argument work. And again, in the context of what they're doing, I'm trying to be charitable and present their argument in the context that they intended it. So if Facebook's revenue is from advertising, then it is not from devices. Well, the revenue is not from devices, therefore it is from advertising. And if we had to map this out, we would map this out that we'd have almost, say, like two enthymemes that were put there, and that will end up with the conclusion that their revenue is from advertising, which is their point. It's also the point of the article. Now, on the side with Apple, if Apple's revenue is not from advertising, then it is from devices. The revenue comes from devices, therefore it is not from advertising. So I'm going to take the third bracketed statement as proposition 3, and with an enthymeme come to number 2, which is like a reworded conclusion that they were presenting. Now again, remember, this may sound like I'm taking some liberties here, but the reality is that we're not speaking in these logical phrases in very syllogistic form. So we have to try to ferret out exactly what it is that they're trying to say. Remember, that's the whole problem. We need to extract the argument from what is being said. And you could see I've already condensed this paragraph from the previous slide, where I can at least show that this is what I'm finding pertinent as something that we need to be analyzing. Now, if Facebook treats users as products, then it is to make money from advertising. Facebook makes money from advertising, therefore they treat users as products. So I'm going to kind of throw in both 7 and 8, and you add that to the enthymeme, and you're going to come up with the conclusion 6, that Facebook treats users as products. I mean, that was the goal. They want to show you, hey, this is what's wrong with Facebook. They treat their users as products. And on the Apple side, if it is true that Apple treats users as products, then it's because of expensive products that they sell. I didn't lay it all out there. And if Apple products are expensive, therefore, then they treat users as products. So I'm going to take statements 9 and 10 and then add that with something that I've supplied just to make the whole argument flow. And then that's going to wind up with what I'm calling the enthymeme, that they don't say explicitly, but it's implied that Apple treats users as products. Now, if I'm trying to figure where does all this all go, if Facebook and Apple just don't like each other, then their dislike is not from competition. The dislike is not from competition, therefore they just don't like each other. That's really the end argument that they're trying to get to. Okay? So here all I've done is I took statement 4 and added what I thought was an enthymeme that was necessary just to simply lay it out. But the whole point of at least this paragraph was to state that Facebook and Apple simply do not like each other. So that's how I would lay out the arguments. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this information and put it onto another slide, and now we're going to look at and analyze it a little bit closer. Okay, so that's the entire string of arguments. Well, it's not string. I'll show you exactly what I mean by that, but these are the various arguments that I think were embedded within that particular paragraph. Now, let's lay it out. What we want to do is check for validity. Now, so far, it seems like the way that I've presented the arguments are valid. So we can almost set that one off to the side. We are going to have to determine whether or not some of these premises are true, because that could be a point that can lead to a valid but an unsound argument. And then in the end, we're going to just make some sort of judgment on these premises and then determine whether or not, if it is valid, that the argument itself is sound and does it have some sort of strength to it. So remember, when we check the validity of an argument, we've already done a section on this. Feel free to restructure it. Remember, we're trying to help them out. That's being charitable. We're not here to beat them up or to have them cower in front of us. We want to get to their point, and then at that juncture, we're either going to accept or we're going to refute. We're going to give them the benefit of the doubt when we're doing their the truth value of their premises. It's not that we're just simply accepting them uncritically. It's that we're going to try to determine the truth value of the premises and word it in a way, structure it in a way that's at least going to preserve the content and the points that they were making. Because remember, we want a steel man argument if we're going to try to refute something. And then in the end, we are going to either have to accept or refute this. We don't have a choice between those two things, right? I mean, other than those two things, I should say. So the way that I laid this out is I did not see these things as dependent upon each other. To me, it seemed like Facebook's revenue from advertising and Apple's revenue from advertising, those two things sort of work together. And then the result of that is going to have some sort of logical, weight on the final conclusion that they try to make, that simply they don't like each other. And also with conclusions 6 and E, right? If Facebook treats users as products, and then Apple treats users as products. I saw those things as come together, but independent from where they got their revenue from. But still part of the overall argument, right? And then finally, the fact that they just simply don't like each other. That was part of it too. So all of this then, the dislikes come from competition. And then all of this then simply bears down on whether or not they do or do not like each other, which was statement 5 from the text. So we're not concerned with winning. I can't say that enough. All we're really after at this point is how is it that we arrive at truth. Okay, so I've kind of said that I'm going to accept the validity. And we've already restructured the argument in order to get there, right? Now we're going to work on determining the truth value, and then we're going to decide whether or not it's sound or such. So the truth is going to be, is there a truth value in that Facebook and Apple don't dislike each other? Now remember, even if we wind up agreeing with that particular conclusion, it doesn't mean that we like the way they got there, okay? So that's what we're going to have to try to determine. So if I were to set out, now that I've laid this all out, if I were going to set out to refute this, I think that I would go after those particular instances, at least initially, right? In other words, is it true that to make money from advertising is using people as products? Is it true that because something's expensive that you then are using people as products? I'm not sure if I accept those truth values. There's going to need to be a little bit more information, but in this argument at this point, I'm going to say I'm going to leave those off to the side because they seem, at least on the surface to me, ad hominem. Now, let me just back up a little bit. Nobody would lay out a particular argument, every paragraph to this extent. That's obvious. But remember how I said some of this becomes second nature. So when you read that article initially, there are probably one or two things that just came up as red flags for you. All this course is designed to do is for you to put a face on that, right? In other words, why are they red flags? What is it that you saw in there that wasn't right? And what exactly can you do to make it right? And if you can't make it right, then how do you refute it? That's what we're trying to do here. So at this point, I'm going to say those two things are ad hominem fallacies. But I have another issue. I'm a little concerned about this idea that their dislike is not from competition, because I believe what they're talking about in that instance of using competition is they're saying because they don't compete with the same products, then therefore that's not why they dislike each other. But that's, an ambiguous use of the term, because the reality is competition can be between people who aren't after the same users. Maybe what they're really after is brand popularity, and one has more than the other, and that's their competition. So I'm going to say that that's what I really think the issue is. So I do agree with their conclusion that Apple and Facebook don't like each other. I don't agree with the reason they got there. So I'm going to say this is a valid argument, but I'm also going to say it's unsound. Now, to bring us all the way back to how we started this course on the first slide of the first lecture, remember I told you, Aristotle's 3 acts of the mind. We just worked through those. We were trying to determine whether or not there was any lack of clarity, ambiguity, and such in the terms. I think there is. And I think that the fact that there is ambiguity in that term has led this whole argument off onto a side note. And also, the second act of mind always ends in a proposition, and propositions are never valid, right? They're only true and false. I'm not sure that that's true. So I think they have ambiguity in that one term, and that term, being ambiguous, led them to a false proposition. And then the third act of the mind was the syllogism, the entire argument, which I found valid. But obviously I don't agree with it. So I'm going to say that it's valid and unsound. I hope this wasn't too confusing for you. It could be that you want to go back and look at it again, perhaps even print out the original text from that paragraph that I put up there, and look at that as we walk through this. There's only so much I can put up on the screen to help make sense of this. But nonetheless, thank you for watching. I appreciate it.